Waubgeshig, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Paul, thanks a lot for having me. Great to join you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And I read your book, Moon of the Turning Leaves, and I enjoyed it. And I want to talk about that. But first, I thought I'd like to talk a little bit about uh, your culture, the Anishinaabe, and where you live and how that all affects your writing. So, first off, where do you live?
I live in Sudbury, Ontario, which is a small mining city about a 4-hour drive north of Toronto. This is considered Anishinaabe territory here in this part of the North Shore of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. And I've been here for about almost 7 years, and I live here with my wife and our 3 sons.
Okay, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a place called Wasauksing First Nation. It's on Georgian Bay, about an hour and a half south of here. It's an island community right near Parry Sound, Ontario. Pretty small reserve, only about 400 to 500 people living there. And the town of Parry Sound right beside it is a population of about 6,500 to 7,000 people. So I spent all my childhood and adolescence there, and then moved away to Toronto for university when I was 19.
Okay. So when you were younger, how much of a traditional culture were you immersed in?
I grew up pretty much in the bush. The home I grew up in, it was pretty humble. For the first little bit of my childhood, we didn't have hydroelectricity or running water, so it was very much out on the land. And in that sense, I had a pretty strong connection, I guess, with the natural world around me. My chores as a kid were hauling water, chopping woods, keeping a fire going out with my dad to fish and to hunt and so on, and gathering food and, traditional natural medicines from the bush and so on. So I guess that's like as land-based a cultural upbringing as I could have had, at that time in the 1980s. And in that era too was a pretty strong revival of a lot of our ceremonies and cultural celebrations and so on, in the wake of colonialism and the brutality of state oppression and so on, right? When I was a kid, a lot of people in our community really worked hard to bring some things back that were either long forbidden, illegal in many ways, or they were shamed out of by wider society, right? Like powwows or sweat lodge ceremonies, or even just using the language on a more regular basis. I grew up when those things were making a comeback. So it was a pretty influential, I think, upbringing in terms of having Anishinaabe culture very present in our home, in our wider family, and in our community. And I think that really helps set a foundation for me of storytelling. And it's really, what I confide in to this day in terms of my self-awareness and the things I try to touch upon in my writing.
You mentioned some things that were illegal or else frowned upon. Was there a time when the culture around you, the outside culture, was trying to eradicate the traditional culture of your people?
Yeah, through the course of Canadian history, it goes back to the creation of residential schools in the late 19th century. And those were state-sponsored institutions run by the church that removed children from Indigenous communities and forced them into these institutions where they were forbidden from speaking their language or practicing their culture. They were forced to cut their hair, and a lot of abuse happened at these institutions, all kinds of abuse and even some outright death. So that was one of the biggest harmful, I think, factors that the state, I think, incurred upon our people, our ancestors. And that reverberated for generations, right? It still does to this day, the traumas associated with the residential school system. But there were other measures too. Up here in Canada, there's a law called the Indian Act that was passed in 1876. And it's a very complicated law, but I'll try to stay as basic as possible. Pretty much it outlawed culture and, gatherings of people in groups of more than 4, and it forbade people from leaving the reservations. They needed permission from what was called an Indian agent. So yeah, it was very much, the reserves were very much like open air prisons, right? And people were confined there and not allowed to practice their culture or their ceremonies. In our community, a lot of the traditional drums and ceremonial items were either confiscated or destroyed. And as I mentioned, when I was, growing up in the 80s is when those items and those practices started coming back, right? After, about 100 years or so. But, that's not to say those impacts are done or that people have entirely healed from them. Those intergenerational traumas linger for a lot of people in our communities, and it manifests itself in different harmful results, right? And I think there's an ongoing healing process that happens, but I've seen great gains over the course of my lifetime in terms of awareness and that healing journey. So I'm proud of what has happened in our community in terms of reclaiming our culture and our ways of life.
Is your writing an attempt to bring back or keep alive or rejuvenate your culture?
I hope so. As mentioned, I'm largely inspired and informed by our culture. And basically what I try to do on the most fundamental level is convey our truths and experiences as they are today as modern Indigenous people. The history we're dealing with, the present circumstances that still have history lingering through them, and the futures that we're trying to create for ourselves now that we have political, cultural, social autonomy within our own communities, right? And within our own families, most importantly. We are able to raise our children as, our ancestors once intended. And I think combining all those things and really having as introspective a look as possible into our culture and into our ways of life really motivates me to write about our truths in fiction. And even though Moon of the Turning Leaves is about a speculative future after, a cataclysmic events, I really try to harness, that hope for the future that people in our communities had despite all the terrible things happening to them, right? It's not just, the ceremonies or the cultural celebrations that, I try to convey. It's that spirit of resilience and of truth telling that I think has really sustained ourselves through generations as we've endured a lot of these terrible things.
How far back does Anishinaabe history go?
Well, that's, really hard to pinpoint. There are oral stories that I grew up hearing about our history that people estimate go back thousands of years. And of course, it's difficult to really define that because there's no written record in sort of a historical way in that sense, with dates or whatever else. But people measure, I think, those moments through generations past. There's another measure too, which is post-contact and our existence as it relates to, the settler society and formal government structures and so on, right? So I would say I'm working with a knowledge of maybe the past few hundred years in terms of my own lineage as an Anishinaabe person. And I think mostly the impacts of colonialism, right? Because that really, for better or worse, defines who we are today, our response to it and so on, right? And of course, like you look at the novel, it's written in a colonial language, and a book is a tool of communication brought over by settlers and so on, right? So just the medium itself is sort of evidence of that existence at the same time, but yeah, to answer your question, I would say I'm dealing with, a few centuries of our recent history and trying to distill that into something meaningful for both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people alike in terms of understanding our ways of life and our realities and what my hopes for the future are, which I try to be a conduit for other people with.
Mm-hmm. There's one thing I'm curious about. I'm down here in Panama right now, on the Caribbean side of Panama, and there are a lot of indigenous people around here. Um, and I meet them often and I've interacted with them quite a bit. And their tribe is called Nyabe, Ngabe. And it's just a similar pronunciation to the last part of your people's name, Anishinaabe.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any relation, or is that just coincidence?
It's probably coincidental, but you hear these stories about how some words seem to have survived across generations and several landscapes too. I think,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just, scraping this off the top of my head, but I think in northern what's now called Canada, where the Dene people live, I think there are similar language structures and words to Navajo in the southern U.S. and even I believe the traditional name for the Navajo is similar. It's Dene, right? So there are those threads between landscapes and cultures and peoples, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that really speaks to the ground that people likely had covered prior to contact, and what some of the similarities can be.
Mm-hmm. So the typical grade school history that we learn says that people came from essentially what's now Russia across the Bering Sea on the land bridge, and then populated the area that's now Canada and slowly moved south. Is that also what you believe?
No, that's not what I believe. Of course, it is an explanation for how some people could have settled here. But and I'm not an anthropologist or any sort of historian, but from what I've seen, that singular theory has been debunked in that sense, in that it's unlikely that the entire Turtle Island that we call of North America would have been populated in that way. And also South America too, right? The land of the condor, as many of the indigenous cultures down there call it. So, there are other theories around nautical migration from other places. Of course, if you talk to indigenous peoples here who are firm believers in their creation stories, people will, adamantly tell you that we have always been here, regardless of any kind of migration, So I believe there's a bigger picture we need to look at rather than relying upon one theory that is commonly disputed, in many professional circles. But that's the whole point of telling stories, right? Is to really look at them in critical ways and interpret them with our different individual contexts too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's see. All right. I'm also curious about the term First Nations. That seems to be something used more in Canada than what I've heard down here. What does that specifically refer to and mean?
I think that refers to just being the first peoples here, the first organized groups, I guess you could say. And the people I'm descended from, the Anishinaabe, we consider our nation to really, surround the entire Great Lakes, right? Our land is huge, and the sort of nation that had been flourishing amongst us Anishinaabe was around that Great Lakes sort of region. So that would have been like the First Nation essentially. But, those traditional territories have since been broken up due to colonialism. And we now reside upon smaller pockets of land that we call First Nations, but would commonly be known as reserves or reservations in the United States, right? But I think First Nation is a more respectful, a more accurate term. It's something that I think provides an identifiable symbolic sovereignty anyways about who we are and how we've been stewards of the land since time immemorial. And yeah, I think it's just something a little more respectful that a lot of other, I guess, settler colonial nations could adopt. And I know in Australia, that term's been adopted a lot more commonly nowadays.
Oh, yeah.
Too. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, let's talk about writing. How did you learn how to write novels?
Oh, I think I learned just by reading, you know. Of course, I had English courses when I was in high school and university where, you know, I learned how to write essays and did creative writing assignments and so on. I went to university for journalism. I have my degree in that field, and I worked as a journalist for about 2 decades before I made the full leap to fiction writing. But I was always writing fiction on the side, and my first 3 books came out while I was working as a full-time journalist for CBC up here in Canada. So I always dreamed of maybe becoming a published author ever since I was a teenager, and I just really didn't know how to draw that line from the ideas in my head to the publishing industry. And so journalism was sort of an in-between in that sense. You know, I stumbled upon that career and ended up really enjoying it too. But I did a lot of reading essentially, and I was really inspired by a lot of books by Indigenous authors, people like Louise Erdrich and Thomas King, Richard Wagamese, and so on, right? Lee Maracle, the late Lee Maracle. So seeing, you know, Indigenous experiences reflected in literature was hugely influential, and I think that empowered me to try it on my own. You know, I don't have any sort of formal learning when it comes to writing fiction. I just sort of gave it a shot in many ways, and I think because of that, I'm still learning. You know, there's still a lot more for me to sort of wrap my head around and try to cover and try to accomplish as a fiction writer. But I just feel so fortunate and so privileged that I've had these opportunities so far, and that I have actually been published. So, yeah, it's an ongoing journey for me, but it's one that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we can learn for the rest of our lives, and that's why it's so you know, it's infinitely interesting. I'm
Agreed.
studying it myself.
Yeah.
How hard did you have to work to find a publisher, you know, to get traditionally published? Did you find an agent first, a literary agent, or an editor? How did that work?
Yeah, it was kind of hard, I would say, because I didn't know how. I wasn't sure which direction to go, or, you know, who to call up or who to pitch a story to. You know, going to journalism school, that's obviously something I didn't learn. But when I lived in Toronto, after I'd graduated and was working as a freelance journalist, I got to know a lot of artists in the city, a lot of Indigenous artists specifically. And when I'd mentioned to them that, you know, I had these short stories that I hopefully wanted to publish someday, and I didn't really know how to go about it, that network of artists, I think, was really helpful, really resourceful in terms of pointing me in the right direction. So fortunately, up here in Canada, we have some funding bodies like the Canada Council for the Arts, like provincial arts councils and so on, where you can apply for grants. And I applied for a grant through the Canada Council back in my early 20s, and that's when I got the ball rolling on Midnight Sweat Lodge, which was my first book, a short story collection. But once I had that done, I had no idea how to get it published. And fortunately, I relied upon that network that I was able to create, and was put in contact with an Indigenous publisher based in British Columbia that published works by Indigenous authors for a few decades by that point. And I think having that niche outlet was very helpful in terms of actually being able to get published, having mentors within that publishing house and among the editors who they partnered me with to, I think, guide me into the industry and really get a good sense of it from there. And I think from there, things just built. You know, I started working on my first novel, published also by Thetis. And then I did want to sort of venture out into more mainstream publishing. And by that point, I'd had more contacts, a bigger network, a better sense of who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do as an author. And that got me, you know, into ECW Press, who published Moon of the Crusted Snow. And then eventually the popularity of that book led me to Penguin Random House Canada, who published Moon of the Turning Leaves up here. And then my agents came on board with me about a little bit after Moon of the Crusted Snow came together. And she's the one who really catalyzed that part of my career and ended up getting me a publishing contract in the US through William Morrow. So yeah, it was like a slower process. And I wasn't like a breakout author by any stretch of the imagination. My first 2 books were sold, very small numbers. But Moon of the Crusted Snow kind of slowly built a cult following, which grew and grew over the years, and that led me to these bigger opportunities for the sequel. But yeah, it was sort of an organic thing, but I just tried really hard to make good connections and to, try to reciprocate within those relationships as best as I could.
Mm-hmm. How often do you write? Do you write every day, or?
I try to, yeah. Like when I have a specific project on the go, I do try to get maybe a page or 2 down, and I set deadlines for myself in terms of getting a draft done and so on. At this point, I've just started some very initial work on another novel, and I'm still sort of shaking it down a bit to see what the focus of it is. So I'm writing little bits and pieces here and there, but my method preferably is to map it all out beforehand, to have like a framework in place and essentially like a point form timeline for the story itself before I actually start writing the prose. So I'm not quite at that point yet with this next book. But I consider like going out for a walk part of the writing process too, because those ideas are spinning in my head. And then, when I get home, maybe I'll make some notes of that. And, even when I'm like doing chores like the dishes or shoveling snow or whatever else, that's when the wheels are turning too. So I consider that part of the writing process too.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. What inspires your creativity was one of my questions. So you've already said, going outside and walking, but also being mindful when you're doing chores. What else really gets your creativity going?
Well, now that I have kids, they really fuel that sort of passion for just creating stories, sharing truths and experiences. They help me see the world in a new way. And there's wonder that they embody just by their processing of the world around us, right? Especially when things are new for the younger ones, you really appreciate the beauty and the complexity of the world around us. And I find that very inspiring just to see the world through my kids' eyes. So, even if I'm not writing about something specifically they're experiencing or witnessing, that spirit, I think, really is motivating in terms of trying to invoke that wonder in other people through writing. Through stories, so that's a big part. But I try to absorb as much art as possible. I listen to a lot of music. That's a daily thing for me. I try to watch as much TV and film as possible. I try to go to plays whenever I can. And this is all a little more difficult nowadays because we have a 1-year-old, right? And our other 2 boys are pretty young still. But whenever I can get out and really experience any sort of artistic expression, that's what motivates me as well, just because everything is storytelling, right? And when you are able to absorb just how somebody conveys a sentiment or an experience or just a broader spirit of the human experience, it's really wonderful. So yeah, I try to take in as much artistic expression as possible too.
I like that. I hadn't thought of TV and movies I had, but I hadn't thought. But I guess you're right. Everything that's telling a story is sort of helping.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, and I try not to be like too analytical or too critical when I'm engaging in that. Like I try to enjoy and appreciate those stories as much as I can. And also, like, I'm not a filmmaker or a TV producer, so I don't know what goes into that. So I mean, I don't deserve to be critical of those things too deeply. And that's why, I sort of set that, I guess, neutral mindset of just appreciating it, essentially.
Mm-hmm. When you sit down to write, do you have any rituals that you do beforehand? Do you do anything that gets your mind in the right place to be creative?
Yeah, I have some select songs that I'll listen to, especially if I'm working on a specific story. I'll choose one or two just to listen to all the way through, and then that sort of sets the tone for me to start writing. That walking too, when I was writing Moon of the Turning Leaves, what I would do is drop my kids off at school and daycare, come back home, and then walk for at least half an hour, and then come back to start writing. One of our customs in our culture is called smudging, and you may have seen it before. It's when you light some medicinal plants like sage or sweetgrass, and it's a cleansing ritual, right? I'll do that not every day, but every once in a while, because I think that really just balances out my spirit. It sort of hits the reset button for me mentally, and that's part of the process for me too. But yeah, also I find talking a really important part of the process. I'll sit here with my wife and say, this is what I'm planning on doing today, or by next week I want to have this part written or something like that, right? Or I'll just talk parts of it through with other friends or family members, but not giving too much away either, because I want them to be able to read it on their own when it's all done. But yeah, I think that sort of verbal exchange really helps me, get into that storytelling mode, especially if I'm going into a part where that's dialogue heavy. Just having those conversations is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. What do you think makes a great book?
I think anything that can help or make the reader empathize with people in the story, and that could be I think transcultural or transnational, right? A good book is something that really strikes at the heart of humanity and can really help a reader feel something for the people in the story, even if they're from an entirely different culture or land or era, right? So I think it's the human element that is the heart of a good story. I think that's really the most important part of it. And I mentioned dialogue a moment ago. Like I may not write a whole lot of dialogue a lot of the time, but I find just that verbal adaptation in a book really helpful for me as a reader, just to know what an individual in the book is like, and what their values and ambitions and so on are. Because it's one thing to talk about who they are when you're writing them, but it's entirely other thing to have them convey themselves in their own words. So I think a good book has some really strong, authentic dialogue, and just lastly, that authenticity. No matter who's writing the story, as long as they're able to express as authentic a spirit as possible within the people they're writing about, that makes a good book too, in my opinion. Because unfortunately you can kind of see through it, if there's something a little weaker, or maybe there's a sort of facade there that can really be seen through, that sort of draws me away from the story itself, right? But as long as there's a genuine spirit or genuine humanity there, then I'm in from start to finish.
Mm-hmm. Very good. When you're writing, how much of your fiction comes from actual experiences? Do you use your own personal experiences and weave them into your fiction?
Quite a bit, I'd say. When I'm writing about Anishinaabe people or Anishinaabe culture, that's all based on what I experienced growing up on the reserve, and even though like these last two books, Moon of the Crusted Snow and Moon of the Turning Leaves, are about Anishinaabe community in far northern Ontario, the social dynamics, the cultural nuances, I think interpersonal relationships that you see in both of those stories are all influenced by what I witnessed growing up in my home community, amongst family, amongst friends, amongst, elders, community leadership, and so on. So they may not be individual experiences or moments per se, but there, I think it goes back to that authenticity that I mentioned a moment ago. I feel like I need to try to capture that authentic spirit by relying upon my memories of what I saw growing up in my home community, but more specifically, I guess, the Moon of the Crusted Snow, the first book is inspired by the blackout of 2003, what's called the Northeast blackout of 2003. I was in my home community when that happened, and being on the res was an entirely different experience than being in the city for a major blackout, right? Like there was a sense of community that came together, and obviously it wasn't as catastrophic as the events of Moon of the Crusted Snow and Moon of the Turning Leaves. I wanted to write about how community can come together in the wake of a crisis like that and really make itself stronger, So in that sense, yeah, these books are based on a real experience, albeit, what you see in the stories are much more heavily dramatized about, these speculative moments that have not come to pass in real life. But yeah, some of the jokes, some of the, I think, slang, that all comes from somewhere real. And I just feel like I have to convey that responsibly and authentically. And I just feel privileged and honored that I'm able to do so too.
Mm-hmm. The bad guys in Moon of the Turning Leaves, they remind me of like modern day right-wing militants. What inspired your bad guys, and is that something that is present in your world, in your life, and are you trying to speak out against something in particular?
Really good question. Thanks for bringing that up. When I was coming up with who a bad guy would be, or bad guys plural, for the sequel, I had a bit of difficulty at first, because in the first book, it's just one bad guy who invades the community and, tries to take it over and is very manipulative and exploitative and so on, right? And so when I was thinking about the antagonizing force in the second book, I knew I couldn't really emulate the same kind of just singular bad guy, right? Readers of the first book wouldn't find it as interesting or maybe as believable. So I thought, I went back to the old like Stephen King adage and what scares me. And, in our current day-to-day reality, heavily armed white supremacist militias are potentially scary to me, people who are preparing for an upheaval and would hope to exert their dominance over others with that opportunity. I find that very scary. So I thought, maybe that's what the bad guys can be in Moon of the Turning Leaves, because who would survive after the end of the world? It is absolutely these people who are specifically preparing for it. These prepper dudes who are stockpiling guns and ammo and all kinds of like rations and so on, right? So I don't have, a lot of people like that in my immediate circles, I do know a lot of people who are preparing for, whatever, but not any who are on the sort of extreme right, neo-Nazi sort of end of the spectrum, So what I did was just looked online, spent a lot of time on YouTube, looking at what preppers do and how they're stockpiling certain supplies like guns and ammo. And if you go on YouTube, it's all there. You can just search SHTF, which stands for Shit Hits the Fan. And you see all these guys who are in plain sight showing you the bins of rounds of ammo in their basement, like shelves, like from floor to ceiling, the walls of guns they have, their separate pantries with all of their cans of food and rations and so on. And it's kind of like a pissing contest in some way, right? Because some of these guys are really, proud of what they've been able to do. And they expect, this abundance that they've accumulated to help them not only survive, but be, I think, not affluence. That's not the right word, but more resourceful or more desirable in the end, because they plan on using these things as currency, right? And so I went down this huge YouTube rabbit hole of looking at videos of these prepper dudes. Yeah. And I spent, a few weeks, maybe around a month doing that, just watching these videos, and like it totally messed up my YouTube algorithm. I couldn't just go and look at funny videos after that. I had to cleanse it somehow of all that stuff. But yeah, it was I was just thinking about what scared me and what I thought would be believable in terms of survivors after the end. And I think it's definitely dudes like that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's going to be preppers, and it's going to be people living traditional lifestyles in the bush who are going to survive. And God knows what's going to happen in the cities.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's going to be bad. All right, there's a theme of hope in the book, a theme of hope and a theme of rebuilding a traditional way of life. Is that something you'd like to see?
Yeah, and I've seen that theme of hope prevail over the course of my lifetime. As I mentioned earlier, we had people in our community who revived or regenerated our cultural ways in the wake of some devastating abuses they endured. And I always acknowledge that even though these elders who, when they were kids and young adults and so on, even though they endured all these terrible things, they still must have had hope that they'd be able to share them again, because they did with me and my peers when we were little kids. So that's, an example of the hope that I saw prevail in my home community. And, that's not to say that I'm naively optimistic about the future, but I've seen how our people survived apocalypse, because that is objectively what happened to Indigenous people here in North America, right? It is a survival of genocide, of displacements, of state oppression, and so on. But fortunately, many of us still have a lot of the cultural knowledge that we had pre-contact. Our languages, on the other hand, are in pretty rough shape, and we need to, work hard to bring them back. But I'm hopeful because I see the spirit of people who are working hard to reclaim these things. So, that's not to say that we need a cataclysm to sort of wipe the slate clean, as what happens in Moon of the Turning Leaves. But I think, having that moment to really take stock of who we are as community members, who our neighbors are, and the kind of world we want to create together is really important. And that's really the point of the story, right? Is there could potentially be some upheaval due to some sort of major catastrophe, and we really need to think about what we want to create in the future together, right? Not as isolated pockets of people or even just as individuals. There is a communal effort that's going to be required for humanity to survive. And I really wanted to touch upon that because, as I mentioned, I've seen that happen over the course of my lifetime, which is hugely inspiring. Is the island in the end of the book, does that represent the island that you grew up on? That's a good question. Where I grew up on the north shore of Georgian Bay / Lake Huron, there are a few pretty big islands along that shoreline, including my own. But I wanted to keep it, a little bit ambiguous because there's a much bigger island, Manitoulin Island, that I think would be more suited for, this community building that's referred to at the end of Moon of the Turning Leaves. So it could be either or, I guess, depending on what the reader wants. What other messages would you like your readers of Moon of the Turning Leaves to take home, to get? Just a strong, healthy future depends on all of us. And of course, on the surface, this is a story about Indigenous people reclaiming and rediscovering their homelands and rebuilding in the vast aftermath of several collapses, several apocalyptic moments. But it involves the wider, I think, population of the landscape to do it together. And of course, the white guys they encounter are bad guys at first, but they end up in places where people have come together. And I was initially, a little bit hopeful at the start of the pandemic when people were, working together to try to get through it. Of course, as we know, that sort of all fell apart. But where I live, I saw people people banding together to create like small scale agricultural projects because, you know, food wasn't coming in from elsewhere because everything was locked down. And people were like trading with each other and, you know, nurturing each other's gardens and so on. Right. And, you know, sharing the harvests of their hunts and things like that. So, yeah, you know, I believe coming together as a community is really important, and you know that's the wider message for any reader. And I think for Indigenous readers more specifically, you know, I just want to show that we have the ability and the autonomy to imagine our futures now. You know, we aren't confined or by or bound to the regulations or the sort of measures of the authoritative states. You know, we're allowed to imagine who we want to be in the future. And I think that can be empowering once you have that moment of introspection or self-realization. And hopefully the book provides something like that for Indigenous readers. And also like for non-Indigenous readers, that spirit I think is relevant too, you know, in celebrating the culture and the history of the original peoples of these lands and how we can work together to really nurture those things.
I agree. I think the most interesting thing in my world about Indigenous culture is that Indigenous culture was not destroying the world, whereas modern day culture is. So, you know, we've got to figure out a way to live without destroying the world around us. And you know, if we don't, there will be an Armageddon. So that to me is very interesting about Indigenous culture.
Yeah, and it is like thanks for bringing that up. Like it is really rooted in respecting the land around us and understanding how it has provided for us. No matter who you are as a human around the world, we all come from an agrarian land-based culture, right? Prior to industrial or technological revolutions of the past few centuries, you know, we all have that strong connection to the land in our recent history amongst our ancestry. So, you know, we all have the ability to nurture that, I think. You know, for some people living in cities, it's obviously a little bit harder to get back out onto the land or into the bush or whatever else. But I think acknowledging that relationship is important for all of us. And yeah, that's another key message I wanted to get across in the book too.
Right. And that's one of the functions that books can have is that people who live cut off from nature and are not going to see it or develop a respect for it through in their own lives can read a book and get a taste of that and perhaps learn a bit. And
yeah, hopefully.
Develop a respect. Yeah. One of the purposes of good literature, I think. Share a different view of the world.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right. So if you could change the world in one way, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. Smash capitalism. No.
All right.
No, I mean, like, if I could change the world, you know, it would be, you know, and I always like I'm cognizant of, again, sounding too naively optimistic, but you know, just providing people the opportunity to learn from each other side by side and to celebrate who we are as humans together. And I think yeah, I don't know what the solution to that is, but I would just try to get people together in as positive and constructive way as possible as neighbors, you know? So I don't know how that happens, but that's how I see a good changed world unfolding.
Getting people to work together as neighbors.
Yeah.
Do you have a copy of Moon of Turning Leaves right there with you?
I don't have it right here with me. Would you like me to get it, or?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you'd like to read a bit from it.
Yeah, sure. I'll be right back.
I should have asked before the interview.
Oh, no worries. I'll be right back.
Yep.
Okay. Good idea. Yeah, I'll just read the first two pages or so. Okay, yeah, here we go. This is the first couple of pages of the prologue. A guttural howl tore through the lodge and breached the birch bark walls. The younger women caught their breath. The air inside the small dome structure grew thicker with each measured exhalation flowing from the young woman sitting upright against a pile of blankets draped with soft rabbit fur, her protruding belly commanding the attention of the midwives, her cousins, and her aunts. The fire burning in the middle of the birthing lodge painted her young, crumpled face a flickering orange. Her partner, the only man inside, nervously swayed on the soles of his feet while his mother and grandmother watched under concerned brows. A large pot of water and cedar boughs boiled on the blackened grill in the center of the lodge. Steam and embers and the medicinal aroma of the tincture floating up and through the hole in the bark ceiling above. The birthing woman's long, thick black braids hung down the front of the tattered light blue button-up shirt, covering everything but her belly, rising and falling with her breath as she recovered from the push. The young man knelt low beside her, rubbing her back and holding her hand while whispering assurances into her ear. Two midwives, an elder and a younger apprentice, knelt before her, watching for the black hair of the child's crown to emerge. The older woman squinted to peer through scratched glasses, while the other one softly commanded the delivering woman, her younger cousin, to prepare to push. She drew a long, energizing breath through her nostrils, and her cheeks ballooned as she exhaled through pursed lips. Her breathing quickened, tightening the space around the 10 people huddling closer to fulfill this birthing rite. The young man's mother stepped forward from her perch beside the fire to deliver him a hand drum. She only nodded at him to avoid betraying the anxiety that was peaking deep within her long into this night of labor. She delivered her son nearly 2 decades earlier in a loud, bright white room in a city hospital hundreds of kilometers to the south. The moment replayed in her mind as they entered this birthing lodge to receive her grandchild, and she wondered if that hospital still stood. The expectant father stood, taller than all the women gathered, and struck the drum 4 times. His voice cracked as he attempted the opening notes of the welcoming song, and he cleared his throat loudly to sync his melody with the beat. The shadow of his head bobbed against the tied boughs and birch bark that made up the interior walls of the birthing lodge, built high enough for the young man to stand comfortably. The skeletal saplings that ran up each wall were buried deep into the ground and woven together tightly to stand year-round. The beating rhythm of the drum invoked a count of the babies born in this ceremonial space in the decades since they tied it together. 8 in total, but only 5 who survived beyond birth and infancy. The younger midwife spoke softly to the expectant mother, low enough for only them and the elder midwife to hear. The young woman tightened her lips, her nostrils flaring with each heavy breath. 2 of her cousins brought 2 plastic tubs of water closer. The elder midwife grabbed a pinch of cedar from a wooden bowl near the fire pit and threw it onto the flames. The tiny green leaves popped and crackled, pumping a sharp, evergreen aroma into the air. The young woman pressed her chin to her chest to push again. Sweat rolled from her creased brow and down her ruddy cheeks. She cried out in another burst of pain, and her partner sped up his drumming, outpacing the tempo of his own voice. His mother and grandmother bounced to the beat in front of the fire, while the shadows on the wooden walls around them danced. It's a bit of Moon of the Turning Leaves.
Very good. Thank you. That was very nice.
Thanks.
It paints a great picture of the inside of the birthing lodge.
Cool.
Someone's giving birth. That's a dramatic moment there. Wob, thank you so much for coming on to the show. Really has been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, Paul, it's been a delight. Thanks for a great conversation. I'm just honored and pleased to be joining you in conversation.